We are back. You are chatting with John P. Today, we are going to be talking about what I believe to be a massive Tag Heuer recall. That is right, a Tag Heuer recall that I recently discovered. I have to share with you. I think it's really interesting, and I'm sure that you will find this to be interesting as well. But once again, thank you so much for coming back. Do not forget to like and subscribe. I really do appreciate it. It really helps me. And also, leave in the comments below because I like to talk with all of you about watches and especially what we have to talk about today in this video. And don't forget to hit the notifications as well. It keeps me making videos for you, which I do enjoy a whole lot. On my wrist today, I have an H. Moser Mayu in white gold manual wind dress watch, which I kind of made a little bit more casual with this strap, prototype from a strap brand that I'm actually working on, so stay tuned for that. You cannot find this yet at delraywatch.com, but news, we have a whole bunch of great new watches we just posted, including some Richard Milles and some more watches that are also more approachable, so if you like watches, and I'm sure you do, check out delraywatch.com, Instagram, The Real John P. So Tag Heuer, okay? Now, Tag Heuer is a brand that's still coming out with new and innovative and exciting watch models when they can, and that's a model that we're going to talk about, and it's been totally recalled from what I can see. And this is called the Tag Heuer Isograph. Now, there will be a picture here, but if you're familiar with this watch, and if you're into watches, I bet that you are, it was recently released at the most recent Basel World, and Tag Heuer came out with it, and it was a bit of a controversial watch. Now, it's a dive watch, and it has a vintage-inspired feel to it. It's not a vintage remake, but it is a watch that looks like it could have come from a vintage catalog if you toned it down a bit. It was also controversial that the watch itself was not a chronograph, but it bared the Autavia name. Now, Heuer was known all the way for most of their time period for producing chronographs, and in some periods of time, only chronographs, especially Heuer, and I believe in the 1960s, chronographs only. For an Autavia to not have a chronograph function was a little bit controversial, but nonetheless, this watch was very well received, and it was because of something that we'll talk about later. Now, this watch basically was fitted with a caliber 5, which Tag Heuer took a Salita movement and made it their own, so to say. And what was unique about this specific watch is that it featured, and it's where the brand gets its name from, it featured a hairspring that was made out of a carbon composite material. Now, Tag Heuer kind of unveiled this at Basel, and they were very excited, and a lot of the industry was excited because it was one of their more approachable models, relatively speaking, but it featured this component that was in their Tourbillon model for $25,000 US, the Nanograph, which is a much higher end watch, especially for the brand Tag Heuer. So to feature that carbon composite hairspring, which is supposedly supposed to make the watch more accurate, especially in conditions of moving your arm a lot, banging things, running into things, it would supposedly have allowed the watch to take shocks a little bit better. And also, don't forget, since it's not a metal that's being used, it's going to be more resistant to magnetic fields, which is always good in precision timekeeping. Now, we talk about the watch, right? The watch existed. Now, it's almost as if the watch does not exist at all, and I'll tell you what I mean. So, recently a customer called in here at Delray Watch. They were very interested in this model, so I made a video basically uncovering this watch, how I found a hidden part of their website with this model on it, pre-Basel. I did a video unveiling it. Now, I cannot find this watch anywhere. Even when you go and you try to find this watch on the Tag Heuer website, it is entirely gone. You go everywhere on the internet, you cannot find the watch. It's completely missing. So this got me thinking, what happened to this watch? Where did it go? Is something wrong with it? Because I know that there are some out there in the wild. I've seen this watch. I've seen it in the stores. I've seen it in 80s. I've seen the watch actually on collectors' wrists. It wasn't that popular because the watch model just came out at Basel, so they were still flooding the market slowly, but I've actually seen the watch, so I know that the watch existed. So it got me thinking, and I said, okay, let me call around a little bit. Let me call some authorized dealers because, hey, a customer wanted the watch, so maybe it was limited release, limited production. This happens sometimes, but I called around either I was told that they never heard of it or that they sold them all out. A couple of authorized dealers told me they were not able to actually order this watch any longer. So I got a little bit confused, right? The models out there. I saw some on the forums. I was very confused about this. So I went to a boutique, and I won't tell you which one, but I went to a Tag Heuer boutique, and I got into a conversation with the gentleman that was working. And at first, I didn't think he was that knowledgeable about watches, but when specifically asked about this watch, he gave me a lot of runaround. Now, we're talking about watches here. We're not talking about anything of, political value or something like that. This is all fun and games, but I found it incredibly interesting that the watch model he no longer could order. He sold the last pieces, so he said, but he couldn't remember how long ago. And I got a lot of mixed information from him about the watch. He knew the watch very well, but then as the conversation went on, he started mentioning something about the caliber 5. Well, if you remember to the beginning of this video a few minutes ago, we talked about how this isograph featured a caliber 5, but with this carbon composite hairspring added. And he was talking about how the Autavia line was probably going to be in the future centered around just the caliber 5. So in a roundabout way, he was kind of telling me that perhaps the model would come out in the future again with the caliber 5, but nonetheless I should buy one of their other Autavia watches that they had in a display case, or if I wanted this carbon composite hairspring, I could buy their $25,000 tourbillon, which they did have, and which I also politely declined the offer because it was not a piece that I probably would ever want to add to my collection, even though it is pretty cool. So knowing this and kind of armed with this in the back of my mind, I thought about it. I mulled it around in my head over the weekend, and I just couldn't believe it. I was, partly a little bit saddened by this, really, because in the back of my head, I kind of wanted to add one of these to my collection. I really liked that Tag Heuer was going to be putting some innovation into some of their more approachable models. They have some innovation at their higher end models, like their tourbillons lines that they've released previous tourbillons in the past, but generally speaking, there's not a lot of innovation that goes into any brand's entry-level models, and I like that about this isograph, right? They had this new, unique, and exciting watch invention, apparently, that they wanted to introduce at this price point, and now I couldn't find it anywhere. And so, in one last attempt to try to find this watch, not only for myself, but the customer, and also out of just curiosity what's going on with this, I Googled it and I found a cached webpage, which there'll be a picture here, of the isograph. But what I found was, the page had been removed from the index, but Google was still linking to it, and it showed the same page as the isograph, but just under the Autavia name. And I said, that's interesting. So maybe it's just the Autavia. The isograph wasn't a catchy name. No, you look at the watch, you look at the picture here, and you can clearly see where the word isograph is removed from the watch and replaced with automatic. And there we have it. The watch is automatic now, no longer isograph. So that means we can say probably, even also when you look at the description of the watch, the movement on the page, they remove the portion about the specific carbon composite hairspring feature that the isograph had. So it looks like basically Tag Heuer is going to be, if at all, just removing that hairspring and leaving a stock Sellita movement in the watch, which is normal for this price segment, or a lot of watches in general, to be very honest, but it's just going to be a caliber 5, which is a Sellita, which there's no problem with, but the price point is the same. So we could say that, what was special for the watch was removed, and also now we have the caliber 5, which probably belonged in the watch in the first place, but the price is going to be staying the same according to the page, but the watch is not in stock. So will this ever happen? Not sure, but there's certainly a lot of evidence here to support that. So right now in the story, we're at the part where, this watch is either totally recalled, the original is definitely recalled, but the whole model in general is going to be totally recalled, or maybe if it comes back out when in stock, it'll be just the caliber 5 or the Sellita without that carbon composite hairspring. But what do I think really happened? Well, if you think about it, this was a new invention and they put it in a watch that was going to be a little bit more mass produced from the brand. This specific hairspring was in the tourbillon, but a lot of people are not buying 25,000 Tag Heuer tourbillons. Sure, it's definitely an affordable tourbillon in the grand scheme of what tourbillons cost, especially from well-known manufacturers, but it's still a $25,000 Tag Heuer, and not many people are willing to jump into that, especially when there are Tag Heuer tourbillons even at half of the price. So I don't think they sold a lot of this. And that's something to consider when you put a new feature in a watch that's supposed to be a chronometer COSC certified watch within a few seconds per day. And if it gets out of that, it's just not going to be a COSC chronometer fully certified watch. And so what I think probably was happening, if I had to take a guess based on what we see here and how the watches totally disappeared, I think probably the watches were not as reliable as they thought they would be. When they have this new invention there, I think that for the watch to need to be a chronometer and they start shipping all of these watches out, and if people were to find out and realize that either they didn't function properly or they were not keeping chronometer specs, well, if they couldn't get the watch in chronometer specs originally, then it wouldn't have been certified, and so it would just have to go back. And if a lot of these watches were ultimately in the field not keeping chronometer specs, it makes it not only difficult for Tag Heuer, but also for the authoritative body that's certifying these watches as chronometers. So do I think that probably the watches were certified as chronometers originally? Yeah, sure. But the process is only a matter of days, whereas in the field, people wearing sports watches, the watches actually get beat up. They get put into the water. They get, taken to the golf course, all over the place, and they're just exposed to so many more things. So even if someone at Tag Heuer was testing this watch with this movement and the modifications, it's really difficult for them to know how it's going to behave out in the field unless they really did their testing at scale. And considering the model really hit the floor pretty quickly and not many people even knew about it coming out at Basel, and they took a movement that existed and they just modified it with, in my opinion, a very critical component to the watch that a lot of the watch depends on. This one little piece could totally ruin the functioning of the watch. So it's really important for that whole system to really actually perform well. And I think it probably just wasn't, so there was a recall. And of course, you can see now that if it does get released, it'll just be the Caliber 5, which is the Sellita without that component, which is going to allow the watch to be much more reliable. At the $3,600 price point, the watch needs to be extremely reliable. And if it's a volume watch, compared to the tourbillon, they can't handle with the frequent coming back of the watches if there are problems. So for them, it would be a nightmare to have one of their more approachable watches that, while is more expensive than some of their other watches, still approachable in the grand scheme of the way that they should be handling it. For all those to be coming back would be a service nightmare, and it's a new invention for them, so they really don't know what to expect in the future. So what do you guys think? What do you think about the watch? What do you think about whether or not the watch is going to be re-released? How do you feel about the removal of that specific component and keeping the price the same? Do any of you perhaps think that this is a cover-up for a much larger scandal, perhaps that the authoritative body that certifies watches as chronometers only testing a few out of certain batches and just stapling the rest with chronometer certifications? I'm not saying that happened, but maybe someone out there thinks that that is happening. I'd love to hear from you about that as well. Full disclosure, no one told me about any of this. No ADs told me about this recall. I came to this conclusion myself using information that's publicly available out there for anyone, and I encourage all of you to do the same, because as watch collectors, we all like talking about new concepts and ideas, and there's only so much we can talk about. So guys, make sure to like and subscribe. I do appreciate it. You can also find me on Instagram, The Real John P. You have been chatting with John P. Ciao.